The sound you hear is a man being throttled to death. This is the start of Octoberpod. Interior: a hotel room in rural Spain. Now.
I awoke to the sound of Paquita squeezing his windpipe with her fat thumbs. Late at night, I still think about how I could have saved him. How I could have leapt up and clawed Paquita's eyes or bashed her head in with the heavy old-fashioned alarm clock. Instead, I lay at his side, paralyzed by fear, pretending to sleep. His tanned arm rose and fell several times, and yet I did nothing, hoping to save my own skin. At length, he died. Then Paquita's hulking, less than half-human form turned to me. I knew her, even though I could not see her hairy face in the darkness. That twisted silhouette and her stench. An unpleasant cocktail of mold and sweat. She tossed the now lifeless body aside and covered it with the rumpled blanket. She unfurled a length of kitchen twine, and I moved not a muscle. The easiest turkey to dress up is the one who's willing to help you with the knots. She hog-tied me, and I think I remember moving my arms and legs to oblige her. Sick. I grew tired of being passive too late. The twine bit into my ankles and wrists as I struggled and fidgeted. Paquita knotted up a shaggy fist and caught me in the cheekbone with an artless blow. I heard a snap as red splotches crept up from behind my temples and swam into view. She gagged me with a red bandana before I could yell for help.
Eres una chiquita maleducada. Gronk prefiere silencio de sus concubinas.
Gronk. That name again. The desolate one from Gordon's books. Paquita unzipped a leather toiletry bag on the vanity, produced a hypodermic, tapped it, squirted out the air bubble. She caressed my buttocks for a moment, stuck the needle in my ass cheek, and shot me up with liquid narcolepsy.
Bride of Neanderthal, adapted especially for Octoberpod by John Iger, from an original story published in Niteblade, a magazine edited by Rhonda Parrish, starring Karyn Raynor, producer co-host of Chicklit Podcast as Amy Strickland, and co-starring Adam Turner, co-host of Diabolical Podcast as Gordon Moreau. Interior: bedroom, 62 hours earlier.
Gordon Moreau sat weeping on the edge of the bed. The scent of the trendy cologne he had bought especially for this night, the anniversary of my meeting him and his wife Beatrice, floated through the hot bedroom, like a reminder of what might have been. His torso rocked forward with each stifled breath. He had tried to hold it all in, but sometimes you just can't. Sometimes tears are all that come. I slipped on my frilly black nightgown, also bought especially for the occasion, and rubbed his back. Thinking of Beatrice again? His face tensed, and crow's feet splayed out of the corners of his troubled eyes. On nights like these, he jammed all his rage into a spot somewhere between his navel and backbone.
Can't get it out of my mind. Seeing her like that. Can't get the sight of the noose out of my mind. I miss her, Amy. Don't you?
I replayed the morning of Beatrice's suicide in my head. I tried to block out her face, the rigors of death. But what I remembered most was the sound of our neighbor's church shoes clip-clopping on the sidewalk as they returned from Mass. The sound of the world turning on its axis. Business as usual. I loved her too. No, I still love her. But I also love you. And I can't stand this despair.
Thanks. For loving me. I need it. There's something not right with me of late.
In the morning, I found myself wishing Beatrice alive again, with her long, agile fingers trailing over my skin while I showered. I could even visualize her gold wedding band glistening with hot water. I drifted through the day, unable to concentrate on work or the soul-crushing gridlock on the Beltway. I felt dirty and unloved and wondered how I could pull Gordon out of his funk. After all, I owed it to Beatrice to watch after him. When I returned from work that evening, I found a bouquet of flowers, a cheap and gaudy arrangement on the kitchen counter. Gordon sat on the couch, picking at the steaming carcass of his TV dinner. These flowers, are they for me?
For us? Read the message that came with them.
Go to Madrid and see Edmundo Ibanez regarding fossil, especially Neanderthal man. Consult first folio, especially passages dealing with desolate one. Obtain skull only. Export via usual contact in Spain. Will deposit bonus upon receipt. Yours faithfully, NS. NS were the initials of our mysterious benefactor, Noah Slag. Gordon propped his stocking feet on the coffee table, right next to the first folio of formulae and the freshly polished pearl handle of his revolver, and shoveled a spoonful of microwaved mashed potatoes in his mouth.
So we need to go to Madrid sometime this week and see this chap Ibanez. Must be an anthropologist or something. He has a Neanderthal skull and Slag wants it shipped to him through a contact I've already met.
Gordon loved explaining things, even if they required little explanation. So I gathered. But what does the rest mean?
Haven't got the foggiest, but I can find out.
Gordon and I, and Beatrice in her day, were poachers. Not of animals, but of artifacts. Occult artifacts. Gordon kept many of these items for his own private collection, but also sold a great deal of them to eccentrics with deep pockets. We took time off from our jobs to acquire anything from Zuni fetishes to burial masks and from books of black magic to skulls. Noah Slag preferred skulls. Gordon had never seen the recluse and doubted that Noah Slag was a real name, but the cash proved real enough. The income Gordon received from Slag for a single job often dwarfed my monthly salary. To this day, I don't know how Gordon reported it all on his tax returns. Perhaps someday we'll meet an IRS auditor aching to explain it.
I have to cancel one of my undergrad classes and some speaking engagements later in the week. Can you take off work?
No. And any way you slice it, I'll be 16 hours short. But I'll go anyway. Days later, staring into the eons-deep blackness worshipped by the cult of Gronk, 16 hours comp leave seemed insignificant.
Interior, a hotel room, now.
Paquita spread open the toiletry bag once more. This time she produced an electric drill not much larger than a child's water pistol. It was made of red plastic with mystical symbols painted on it with gold nail polish. I recognized a few of the symbols. An eye, a sunrise, and a bison. Paquita fitted the drill with a small bit and connected the battery house and the handle. She squeezed the trigger. The tiny motor hummed and the bit twisted several revolutions. While I was unconscious, 3 others, hags like Paquita, stooped and hairy, their heads filled with atrocities and inhuman motives, had lumbered to the bed. Each wore a black robe over cheap, loudly patterned pantsuits that might have known the bargain bin of a thrift store, but certainly not a rack in Corte Inglés. Crude masks, a bison, a hare, and a death's hand concealed their gnarled and bearded faces. They babbled to one another in thickly accented Spanish. Paquita filled her role as alpha female with gusto, dealing out orders peppered with guttural barks and retching sounds. Hare hauled in a burlap satchel filled with candles, which she scattered about the room, and lit with a pack of hotel matches. Bison drew closer to me, sniffed and fondled a strand of my hair, and pressed her dirty index finger against my forehead. Then she ran her rough, hirsute hands over the balls of my feet, the goose flesh on my buttocks. Paquita set the drill aside and donned her own mask. A golden sun with beams of papier-mâché light radiating from its expressionless, 3-eyed countenance. Hare having lit the last candle, presented Paquita with a smaller satchel made of black velvet. She thrust her hands inside and cradled its contents to her sagging breasts. When I saw the tiny hole punched through the skull, in the forehead just above the nasal cavity, I knew Gordon must be dead.
Monsters do have their place. In the zoo, in your nightmares, in the deep, in your favorite horror movies, but not on your phone during an ad break. Politically motivated interests are seeking to influence you through the ads placed on this podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Edward October, reminding you that we have very limited control over the ads you hear on Octoberpod. Please remember that only the ads and promos I read with my own voice carry the endorsement of Edward October and Octoberpod. Furthermore, I and the makers of Octoberpod repudiate any entity advertised which seeks to promote hatred, anti-American or anti-democratic sentiments, or the spread of misinformation. Now, with that in mind, Octoberpod will return after this brief ad break. It's intermission time. I'm your host, Edward October. If you're new to Octoberpod AM, welcome. On this show, we like to tell true, true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal. But between the acts of Octoberpod, we like to do deep dives into our classic horror and horror-adjacent pop culture obsessions. On some occasions, we use the intermission as an opportunity to chat with some of our fellow indie horror creators. This is one of those occasions. This morning's drama, Bride of Neanderthal, is based upon a story originally published in issue 11, I believe, of the late great horror and dark fantasy literary magazine Niteblade, which was edited by this morning's guest, Ms. Rhonda Parrish. Welcome, Rhonda.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm excited to talk with you.
Are horror and dark fantasy the best descriptors for Niteblade, or would something like speculative fiction work better?
When Niteblade first started, I called it Niteblade Fantasy and Horror Magazine because I think I anticipated sort of a sword and sorcery level of fantasy stories and kind of like a Stephen King-esque sort of horror stories. But obviously that is not what it actually grew into. I think looking back, if I were going to rebrand it, I would probably, yes, have called it fantasy or dark fantasy and horror.
I remember Niteblade being a very special publication for both readers and for up-and-coming writers. And I know that it holds a special place in your own heart. What would you say made Niteblade so special?
Well, thank you for that. The fact that Niteblade has been out of print or at least we haven't been creating new issues of it for over 10 years, and people like yourself are still asking me about it and saying kind words about it, I am immensely proud of that. I cannot even begin to put into words. It feels like a stone thrown in a pond, and like the ripples are still going out and out and out. And every once in a while I will go to a convention and someone will come up and introduce themselves to me and I will recognize their name, and it will take in this half second while I'm trying to put together why I know that name. They will say, "You published my story in episode X of Niteblade," or "My poem was in episode issue Y of Niteblade," and they will tell me that publication encouraged them when they were just starting out, or they're very proud of the art from Mars that they still have on their wall, that sort of thing. The number of people who have Niteblade stories makes my heart very happy. Niteblade was a very special publication to me. It taught me so much. I started it out of a desire to sort of do better than some of the let me back up. In 2007, well, 2006-ish, e-zines were kind of new. They weren't brand new, but they weren't super well established. And a lot of them were just sort of people's blogs that they would solicit submissions for and then put those submissions on their blogs unedited and not pay any of their contributors. And I was submitting to some of those sorts of markets and thought, I can do better, which I think all authors to some extent can relate to, because I think it inspires a lot of writing as well as apparently magazines. So, and I believe I did do better, but I was definitely learning as I went. So Niteblade taught me so much. It taught me how to edit other people's work. It taught me more about writing my own, because when you're reading a ton of submissions, then you learn about story. It taught me how to put a book together. It taught me about how to work with other people. It taught me about giving up control, because I, at my heart, am a little micromanager control freak, but I had to give that up and trust the layout person and trust the, which was my husband, Joe Parrish, and trust the person who did the website version, which was my friend Beatty Wilson, and trust Alexa Seidel when she became the poetry editor, to do their jobs. And they did them fantastically and way better than I could have myself. So it taught me a lot as a person and also as somebody working in publishing. And I think it's special to people who are not me, to authors and readers as well, because it was special. It balanced the line between professional and friendly. I always tried to be professional, but also to remember that the people that I was working with were people, with like fully formed people who did more than just write, and to be friendly and to be kind. And I think that goes a long way. And we did things within that atmosphere and that sort of feeling of camaraderie that you couldn't do probably with most bigger magazines. Like we adopted chimpanzees from the Fauna Foundation in Quebec. So we sponsored chimpanzees who were like at a rescue farm as a community, as myself and the writers, and like as a group. And that sort of thing, I think, brings you together a lot. And wow, I am rambling. But yeah, if anyone is not familiar with Niteblade and wants to see the cover art and some of read the stories and the poems, and if you go to niteblade.com, which is NITE blade.com, the issues are still archived there. I think they cost you $1. But yeah, they are all there. And they are definitely still worth checking out, I think. Of course, I'm biased.
In addition to editing Niteblade, you're also a successful author, editor, and self-proclaimed hydra-slayer. Tell us about some of your other work.
I definitely do wear a lot of hats, as the saying goes. And most of them actually can be traced back to Niteblade. I'm not going to lie. Because I think most people, if anyone has heard of me, they usually have heard of me because I edit a lot of anthologies. I've got several series that have wrapped up. I have a new one in production right now called Hauntings in Hoarfrost, which is gothic-inspired winter short stories and poems, which is fantastic. So yeah, most people know me from anthologies, which is not a thing I would have likely gotten into if not for Niteblade, because that is where I cut my teeth on editing and learning how to put these things together. I've also written some nonfiction, just spooky stuff. So I co-wrote Haunted Hospitals with Mark Leslie a few years back, which was super fun. That was my first foray into telling true ghost stories. And I followed that up with Eerie Edmonton, which I wrote with Rhonda Anderson, who is a psychic medium here in Edmonton, where I'm from.
What is some advice you would give as an editor to writers, especially horror writers, trying to break into the business?
Find your people. That is the number one thing, because this is really, really, really hard. Writing is hard. Writing for publication is harder. And publishing is a broken business that is really, really hard. And you don't want to have to try and do it alone. So my number one piece of advice is surround yourself with people who are trying to do the same things that you are doing. And ideally, if you can, make friends with people, sincerely make friends and connections with people who are further along their journey than you are, and people who are further back on their journey than you are. Because being able to look forward and look back and to have friends who have perspectives from those places is invaluable. But in a more sort of, in less of a surviving publishing and not getting burned out or depressed or giving up sort of way, my advice would be super simply read and follow guidelines. Because you would absolutely be shocked at how many people do not. So I read a lot of slush. A lot of it. Hundreds and hundreds of stories a year, usually. And I can probably cut the first... No, I'm not going to put a percentage on it because I will be wrong no matter what I pick. But if you read and follow the submission guidelines, that gets you past the first hurdle that a lot of people don't get past. And that matters. As for tropes to avoid and whatnot, I mean, it is tricky because for every rule there is an exception. I would say if you're submitting to a themed anthology in particular, though, one thing that cannot be overstated probably enough is to not pick the lowest hanging fruit. There is a themed anthology call for stories about blue hair. Then don't be one of the 33 people who writes a story about haunted blue hair that tries to kill the person whose head it is upon. Be the person who writes the story about the blue leg hair that comes to life at night and writes stories, and they'll somehow work that into something. Anyway, be different is what I am trying to say, because that editor is going to have to pick only one of those 33 stories about the blue hair that comes to life on the person's head and tries to kill them, because they don't want an entire anthology of that story. And they are probably not going to have more than one story about the blue leg hair telling stories at night. So it increases your chances of getting picked if you're not only competing to get into the anthology, but competing for the one spot about the hair coming to life and killing people.
So, what are you working on currently? I understand that you have a new Kickstarter campaign.
We do have a new Kickstarter campaign. This is brand new for me. I'm kickstarting an anthology. It is for my anthology, Winter Gothic anthology called Hauntings and Horror Frost. At the time of my recording this, the Kickstarter is still ongoing, but by the time it goes live, it might be done. I'm not sure. Right now, we've opened up tons of stretch goals, and we're so close to being able to pay my authors more, which would be fantastic. If the Kickstarter is closed, I think that there's still going to be late pledges. I'm not 100% on that, but I will give you a link. Maybe you can include that just in case. And yeah, if there isn't, the book is coming out in January because we wanted a wintry release date, and it's going to be super amazing. There are it's mostly stories. There are some poems as well. And I'm really, really proud of it. I wanted to do something wintry and scary as I live in Canada. Winter is most of the year here. Sometimes it feels like, and there's so much potential for spookiness there that I'm so excited to share this anthology with everyone.
I'm certain that everyone out there in listener land will be eager to get their claws into that. Now, where can people find you on social media?
On social media, I am only on Twitter. Well, that's not true. I'm kind of on Facebook, and I will send you the link for that. But mostly, I am on Twitter at twitter.com/Rhonda Parrish. My website is rhondaparish.com. And again, the Patreon is probably the best place to find me. And that is patreon.com/Rhonda Parrish. And I put up a lot of stuff there that's free for everyone to read. So it's not all paywalled. So you can certainly check that out. And my newsletter is linked from I think it's only linked from the website. Actually, it might not be linked from the Patreon. And I send that out about once a month. And it usually has some sort of free content in it, like a story or a poem or something, as well as updates about everything that I'm working on.
You've been listening to a conversation with multi-talented author and editor Rhonda Parrish. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and I hope I didn't ramble too much.
And now I think it's past time we return to this morning's drama. The thrilling conclusion of Bride of Neanderthal starts now. Interior, transatlantic flight to Madrid, 22 hours, 56 minutes ago.
A commercial airliner, seated next to a man whose face is buried in the cold embrace of Formulae de Profundis, is no place for romantically frustrated playgirl. I found myself rubbernecking the pretty Spanish women and some even prettier Spanish men as they shuffled towards the bathroom or the galley. A flight attendant named Kika caught my eye. Her dark skin and shining black hair reminded me of Beatrice. I kept making excuses to flirt with her by ordering extra drinks and moist towelettes. Gordon usually encouraged such flirtations. I mean, he doesn't own me.
A bit more subtlety, please, darling. Our fellow passengers will think you're positively predatory.
Don't blame me if I'm looking a bit desperate.
Want to hear about Gronick? He's mentioned and named in Formulae de Profundis as the Desolate One. It describes him as something as a demigod, powerful being who ruled before modern man peopled the earth.
Before modern man? You mean this was a caveman deity?
Please. Caveman is such an inelegant descriptor. But to answer your question, yes, I believe this Gronick fellow was worshipped by troglodytic pre-modern species of men, like Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal, who might have lived in very small populations subsisting in obscure corners of Europe, and interacted with ancient Greeks and Romans. Now we know that...
We? Are you speaking for the entire occult research community?
Yes. Now we know from Roman historical documents and a number of vaguer fireside tales that a mystery religion arose shortly before the reign of Constantine. This sect was dedicated to the adoration of a three-eyed deity, which they called Gronok, or, as translated by the mad abbot who wrote the Formulae, Gronick. The sect split up and went underground as Christianity spread throughout Europe. The relics of Gronick, supposed to possess profound spiritual powers, were lost. There's even an account of the Knights Templar battling a demon named Gronka during the Crusades. And then there is this chap Ibanez.
You don't mean to suggest that these Neanderthal fossils are part of Gronk's remains?
I don't know. Slag certainly believes it to be so, and as long as he pays for the skull, I'll believe it too.
The luminous Kika served us our in-flight breakfast. A bagel, smoked salmon, and tomato juice for Gordon, a croissant, fruit, and coffee for me. I pressed my face against the window, sipping my coffee, and watched the sea of clouds billowing underneath us. I've never been to Spain.
Very soon you shall.
A car, organized for us by Noah Slag himself, met us at Barajas and drove us to a village outside of Madrid. Madrid, the great city I'd hoped most to explore, passed by quickly. Gordon promised we'd return to it one spring. He never made good on that promise. Between naps, he explained how everything would go down.
Slag or someone in his employ has contacted this chap Ibanez and set up an interview with the representatives of the Mid-Atlantic Journal of Paleobiology. He was told to expect Dr. Eugene Mandrake, that's me, and his secretary.
That's me, I suppose. A bit patriarchal, isn't it? Don't I even get an alias? Since much of our work left us vulnerable to prosecution, we'd used aliases on other jobs.
Slag is a bit of a dinosaur, isn't he? He didn't provide a name for the secretary. I suppose you can choose any alias that suits you.
I'll just dust off an old chestnut and assume my alter ego from the Cornelius Agrippa affair. Nancy Craig. Ibanez worked at a small research institute in the village of Maranya, 90 minutes north of Alicante. Maranya resembled small towns all over the world, in that a single main street bisected its rows of shops and modest homes. Everything appeared isolated in time by a quarter century or more, a town teetering on the edge of cliché. Rooms for Dr. Mandrake and Miss Craig had been reserved at Casa Flores, an inn just a block from the institute. Its rooms were small but comfortable. My double bed, made up with white linens and frilly orange pillows, sat beneath the room's only window. An orange quilt, the kind surely knitted by the calloused fingers of a plump grandmother, hung from the footboard. Mismatched wooden nightstands flanked the bed, and slender flamenco dancers seduced each other with dark eyes on a paper fan above the door. After checking in and dropping off our luggage, we stopped at a lunch counter. Men, off from work for siesta, lounged about the bar pulling on espressos or glasses of beer as they watched a soccer match on the wall-mounted TV. Gordon and I silently ate a selection of tapas with a pitcher of the house wine. Halfway through our meal, 3 strange women lumbered to the counter. They might have been described as hags, stooped and hairy as they were. One wore a smock from the kitchen at Casa Flores, with her name, Paquita Flores, embroidered on the lapel. The stench of mold wafted from their sweaty bodies, souring my appetite. The men at the lunch counter stood, looking for reasons to pay up and split. One of them, a lank filling station attendant, crossed himself with stubby, oil-stained fingers and ran to the men's room. Paquita exchanged a handful of pesetas and a few coarse words with the man behind the counter. Gordon nodded towards one of the strange women.
Do you fancy her too?
All body types are beautiful in their own way. Now please don't be catty, darling. It doesn't suit you.
Por favor, Dr. Mandrake. My name is Edmundo Ibanez. Nies. Not Ibanez. Ibanez.
I'm so sorry. I had no idea that...
Think nothing more of it, amigo. It's a common enough mistake. Anglophones mispronounce my name all the time.
Speaking of which, my secretary and I both speak serviceable Spanish. But I dare say your English is much better. You speak it without a trace of accent. I hope you don't mind if we converse in our native tongue.
Ibanez led us down a long, anonymous hallway in the basement of the institute. Sickly bluish-white paint covered the cinder block walls, and fluorescent lights flickered over our heads.
Tell me, Dr. Mandrake, where would I know you? Your face is one I recognize, but I cannot pin it to a, curriculum vitae with which I am familiar.
I'm afraid it hasn't appeared in the pages of any scholarly journal for quite some time. Still, I managed to lecture at Wesleyan, a few colleges in the UK, and the Universidad de Murcia.
All of this was true, but Gordon actually spoke on demonology, ancient religions, and matters of the occult, never paleobiology or its cousin cryptozoology, which even he regarded as pseudoscience.
Ah, Morthia. Yes, that is it. Didn't you lead the discussion of Piltdown Man last winter?
Gordon winced, almost imperceptibly, as his cover story forced him to tread deep and murky waters.
Indeed. Or rather, I was in attendance. Piltdown Man and Peking Man are specialties of mine. Or rather, they interest me a great deal. I like to stew over the older incarnations of man.
Edmundo, do you have plans this evening? No. Well, it's settled then. Dr. Mandrake and I would love to dine with you tonight. After we tour your workshop, of course.
Sí, gracias. I should be delighted.
Mission change the subject accomplished. Ibanez unveiled his inner sanctum. It possessed neither the orderliness nor the surplus of technical equipment one might expect. Brushes of varying sizes, old newspapers, and cheap hairdryers littered the wooden workbenches. A dusty typewriter sat at the center of Ibanez's desk, fenced in by a collection of empty bottles.
Please excuse the rubbish. I have an affinity for Fanta Naranja. We are unaccustomed to such distinguished visitors.
Of course, had he known our true intentions, he might have been less cordial. He told us his new find is in the back, and led us to a dark corner of the lab, or should it be called a workshop, to a long table enshrouded with a dingy tarpaulin. Ibanez smiled and lovingly peeled back the tarp to reveal the ancient skeleton.
We believe his name was Gronk.
Gordon bared his teeth when the light struck the skull, as if the revelation caused him physical pain. Even I felt a bit queasy. And Ibanez, who'd studied the fossil for months, emptied his lungs with a single exhalation. The bones had been polished to a smooth, buttery sheen and arranged on the table in their intended anatomical configuration. Gronk would have stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. He'd had the third finger of his right hand broken. His forehead and teeth jutted forward almost comically, a common feature for Homo neanderthalis. His hollow eye socket stared sightlessly up at us, as did a third cavity, bored into the thick ridge of his skull. I asked about the socket for this third eye.
Our friend appears to have endured what may be the oldest surgical procedure on the planet, trepanation. It's the process by which a piece of skull is removed from the person suffering. Well, from whatever nonsense the surgeon thought ailed him.
Bueno, doctor. You are quite the scholar. You see, Senora Craig, the bone shows the signs of years of healing. See these patches of thick bone radiating from the edge of the cavity? With this, and the relative precision with which the chunk was removed, Dr. Mandrake's theory is quite probable and not entirely unheard of for Neanderthals.
Why would anyone agree to have that done to them?
Why not? Many primitive peoples did it as part of an exorcism. Open a trapdoor to help the evil spirits escape. Other sects, including various New Age philosophies, believe trepanation aided those on a path to enlightenment by enabling them to open their third eye.
Paquita, the hook-nosed, barrel-chested hag we'd seen earlier, greeted us at the door of the restaurant adjacent to Casa Flores and showed the three of us to a seat. No one crossed themselves as she passed, but I noticed that Ibanez refused to look at her as if she, like Medusa, might turn him to stone. You really should practice your conversational Spanish on her.
Now you're being catty.
She led us past deli cases filled with sausages, great silver heaps of fresh sardines, platters of olives and dates, cocktail glasses filled with chunky gazpacho, a squat almond cake glistened with syrup, and handmade apricot candies lined the countertops. Steam from a potent, unseen espresso wafted out from the shadows of the humble kitchen. After seating us, Paquita disappeared behind a curtain and returned shortly with our meal, a carafe of the house wine, a loaf of crusty bread, slices of queso manchego, and 3 steaming bowls of paella. Ibanez and I ate greedily, digging the last bits of meat from each muscle and savoring the pop of capers between our teeth. Gordon looked preoccupied, even sick. He pushed aside the plump shrimp, their eyes black, antennae curling around their pointed heads, and muscles to pick at the rice and vegetables. Ibanez noticed his lack of appetite, and good taste for that matter, and began stealing the shellfish from his bowl, and depositing the mussels into my bowl and the shrimp into his own. Gordon pretended not to notice, and turned his attention to the manchego. Ibanez rolled his eyes, trying to make me laugh at Gordon's expense. Moments later, Paquita returned with espresso and 3 wedges of almond cake. Ibanez averted his eyes as she approached. Gordon shoveled down his dessert and downed his espresso with little more than a single gulp before leaping out of his chair.
I believe I'll retire. I'd like to jot down some notes for the article before bed.
The words, "I believe I'll retire," were a signal we had agreed upon before dinner. Gordon would come up with some bullshit reason to go back to his room while I stayed behind with Ibanez. I was to steal Ibanez's keys to the Institute workshop, hide them in a prearranged location, and keep him occupied while Gordon used the keys to break in and get Gronk. If it's all the same to you, Doctor, I'm going to finish my dessert.
Suit yourself. See you both in the morning.
Intense fellow.
I managed to pick Ibanez's pocket 20 minutes before he dropped me off at my room. He didn't even flinch. I swung open the bathroom window and snaked my hand along the outside wall of the inn. I could barely reach the exterior ledge of the window in Gordon's room. I pushed Ibanez's keys onto the ledge until I felt them touching the glass. Of course, Gordon would never get an opportunity to find them.
Interior. Hotel. Now.
86. I turned my head to the corpse in the corner with a twinge of guilt. Ibanez lay still, enjoying his final sleep. I'll soon get what's coming to me, I thought. The hags knelt around the bed, chanting in voices as shrill and discordant as razor blades strumming piano wire.
Aclamada Gronk.
Only Paquita and Death's Hand, who pinned me to the mattress so hard I could scarcely breathe, remained standing. Paquita held Gronk's skull in front of her masked face and shifted her weight foot to foot, as if entranced.
Rezara Gronk, nacido antes del hombre, nacido perfecto.
Visions of my death played themselves in my head like black and white newsreel footage. I tried to clear my thoughts and meditate as Beatrice and Gordon had taught me, but I could manage no deep breaths. Bound and rocked by despair as I was, soon the screaming and sobbing would start. Couldn't remember my mantra. That damn chanting stamped out all concentration.
Mis ojos alimentan mi espíritu. Mi espíritu glorifica mi cuerpo. Mi cuerpo sirve al Gronk todopoderoso como una vasija para mi alma. Le doy mi alma libremente al Gronk, quien abre mis ojos alimentan.
Paquita stripped off her black robe and her thrift store blouse and slacks. I could not help but stare at her naked form. A thick layer of wiry black hair radiated from her pubis to her shins and shoulders. Her breasts sagged nearly to her downy navel. Her body bore the scars of a mother who had borne and given suck to an entire clan of children. Are these other hags her daughters? What of the father? Perhaps she'd held the skull of he who had fathered her kind eons ago. Indeed, Paquita became even more bestial without clothes. Those most basic fetters of societal bondage. The mind wanders at times like these. Looking at Paquita's unusual body had me contemplating my own. All of my other lovers, except Gordon, who left everything unsaid, have told me I'm beautiful, but I never believed them. I always felt that my hair and chest were too flat, my skin too sallow, and my proportions too uneven to achieve real beauty. Truth is, I've only felt beautiful in Beatrice's arms. And when she died, well, I guess I stopped caring quite so much about my looks.
Mi espíritu glorifica mi cuerpo.
She pricked her finger with the drill bit and sketched a third eye on my forehead with her own blood. The other hags, except Death's Head, wailed in delight.
Alégrate, chiquilla. Pronto tú también serás una concubina de Gronk.
Amidst this weird prelude to my own trepanation, I took little notice of Death's Hand. If I had, I might have noticed a more upright posture, an uneven left breast with lumps like a wadded pair of Argyle socks, a mask that fit more loosely than the others, a beard of yak hair held to the skin with spirit gum, and a well-manicured hand reaching for a pearl-handled revolver secreted in the folds of the ceremonial robe. A number of locals heard the shot that splintered Paquita's face. They had suffered for months under the wickedness of the hag cult. To protect the man who shot her, they manufactured a number of interlocking stories to tell the policia. Obliging people, these villagers. All the bodies that had accumulated in my room were cremated, and the ashes were dumped in a lake 60 kilometers outside of town. We later learned that this was a common disposal method for the criminal element in the region. When asked, ¿Qué le pasó a esa Paquita Flores? They would shrug. She got mixed up with the wrong crowd. Heroin fiends and the like. Could be dead. Gordon, while I was busy robbing Edmundo Ibanez, had himself mingled with the wrong crowd. Instead of waiting for me to snatch Ibanez's key, he followed Paquita's 3 comrades, who, wonder of wonders, had also been dispatched to steal Gronk's skull. He witnessed their amateurish breaking and entering from the shadows. The 3 split up to ready themselves for the ritual. Gordon tracked one through an alley, shot her, stole her clothes, and donned her mask. Gordon, using his imperfect Spanish, snarled commands at the other hags, cocking back on the hammer of his smoking revolver. Don't ask me how he managed to smuggle it out of the States, but I'm sure Noah Slag had a hand in it. The hags obeyed and lay face down on the floor. Taking care to keep the gun trained on them, Gordon rifled through Ibanez's pockets, found his penknife, and cut my bindings. Then he pulled the mask and several handfuls of yak hair from his face and handed me his robe.
Put this on. Lock yourself in the bathroom. I've got some unpleasant work to do.
Eyes wide with shock and fear, I dashed to the bathroom, skipping over the hags lying on the blood-spattered carpet, slammed the door, pressed my body against the shower tiles. I heard Gordon pacing over squeaky floorboards.
Ruego que abras tu corazón a Gronk, growled one of the hags.
Then Gordon emptied his revolver. We fled from Moranya and left the locals to clean up our mess. We spent the next 4 days in Alicante. My supervisors back home were thrilled, while Gordon tracked down Noah Slag's buyer. On the 3rd day, I visited the ancient Moorish Castillo that glowers down on the city from its high perch. It had been restored and converted to a museum for contemporary sculpture. As I navigated the rows of black figures cast in bronze, or carved from marble, or lacquered ebony, I thought of Edmundo Ibanez, a sweet old man who did not deserve his fate. I'd robbed him, and he died for the sin of lingering too long outside my room. Gordon located the dealer, sold the skull, and collected half our fee. When he returned to our dimly lit hotel suite, we made love without frustration or tears, and without giving any thought to the dead. Then we ate a simple supper at a tapas bar with a view of the Mediterranean.
I've waited to do this for a long time. Too long.
To do what? Feed me chicken croquetas? Gordon produced a ring from the pocket of his tweed jacket. He slid it onto the 3rd finger of my left hand. I had seen this ring before, many times. Recognized its sheen. Knew how the gold would sparkle when turned in any attitude. Had memorized the phrase engraved on the inside of the band. It had belonged to Beatrice.
Stick around after the credits for a brief word from some of our fellow indie podcasters, creators, and friends. There may even be some bloopers and outtakes as well. You have been listening to Octoberpod. Octoberpod is produced, edited, and directed by Edward October. The series co-producer is MJ McAdams. Logo and banner graphics by Jessica Good. Edward October illustrations based upon an original character design by Nick Calavera. Select still photography courtesy of Unsplash.com. Select music cues by Dr. Dreamchip, various stock music and sound effects courtesy of freesound.org. Music cues from Bigfoot Apocalypse and Thorax, theme from Octoberpod, composed by Nico Vitese. All other images and music FX cues, except where noted, are sourced from within the public domain. Watch Octoberpod home video on YouTube for new videos each month. Follow us on Instagram and on the dumpster fire formerly known as Twitter at Octoberpod VHS, and on TikTok and Blue Sky at Octoberpod. Or find all of our links on the World Wide Web at octoberpodvhs.com. For business inquiries or story submissions, email octoberpod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed Octoberpod, we'd be very pleased if you told your friends about us. And comment with a 5-star or equivalent rating wherever you're listening. The man who spoke to you was Mr. Edward October.
Hey there, I'm Tara.
And I'm Jessica, and together we co-host the podcast 3 Spooked Girls.
If you love the paranormal
or murder,
join us on Mondays for full-length episodes where we discuss our favorite paranormal stories and true crime cases.
And join us again on Thursdays for our mini-sodes called Stabby Snippets, where we tell you all about true crimes happening in the news.
You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, wherever the hell else you listen to your pods at. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by using the handle @3SpookedGirls.
Come and hang out with us and get your spooky on while we scare the hell out of you.
The 3 Spooked Girls.
Do you love old-time radio?
Yes!
Do you know absolutely nothing about old-time radio?
Also yes.
Then Madison on the Air is for you. Follow Madison, a modern-day makeup influencer, as she zaps back into the golden age of radio. Every episode is standalone with a wide variety of genres to choose from, like detective noir,
You put the dick in private dick.
superheroes,
So I am in the body of the Green Hornet.
westerns,
Saloon fight! Now this is a Western.
sci-fi,
Dude, the Martian's got a freaking heat ray!
plus classic characters.
Toto! Oh, I gotta get that dog into an obedience class. Really digging Dracula's OG goth style. What if I killed freaking Sherlock Holmes?
And many more. Actual old-time radio scripts adapted.
It's like if the MST3K riff tracks guys were in the movies they riff.
Start at the beginning or jump around to any title that grabs you. New episodes premiere the first of every month.
Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Listen up, true crime fans. I have a podcast that you won't want to miss. A heartfelt show that focuses on lesser-known crimes from around the globe called Our True Crime Podcast.
All right, buckle up, I guess. We
All
gotta
right,
put our
ready?
seatbelts on. We gotta go.
Every week, hosts Jen and Cam will guide you through a new case backed up by meticulous research and delivered with the utmost respect for victims and survivors. Cases like the fatal exorcism of Joan Vollmer.
Yes, eyes can turn red and appear to glow from increased adrenaline and blood flow.
I did not know that.
And the Haynes family massacre.
I'm almost afraid to hear it.
As a parent, I don't even know. I don't know.
You'll not only learn about the cases, you'll feel like you're part of a conversation with witty, lifelong friends. That's what truly makes this our true crime podcast. So, whether you're a true crime aficionado
I thought you might say that. I was hoping anyway.
or a casual listener,
That's a baseball team, Jen, if you didn't know.
Oh, I figured it was some kind of sports ball thing.
sit down and join us for our true crime podcast. Listen on your favorite podcast apps today.
It's a Sunday. I'm sitting in a dark, dark room talking to my best buddy about
Crime.
That's right.
Oh, and I'd be doing my audience
Really, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear here, so I'm going to try not to. But this is,
fuck my face.
yeah. But as a writer of fiction, the thing that is probably most relevant to people who listen to this podcast is I wrote a YA horror novel called Hollow, which was published by Taiki Books. It came out in 2020, which is not ideal timing for trying to promote books, but especially books where bad things happen because it's horror. But I'm super proud of it, and it got nominated for an award or two, so that was a nice little treat as well.
Reading for the part of Amy in Bride of Neanderthal.
Now, I'd be doing my audience a disservice if I didn't mention that your Twitter is one of the best places online for Edmonton Oilers content. It's not unusual to see play-by-play live tweets of Oilers games on your timeline.
I love the Oilers this year's team in particular with all my heart. And that might be part of why I'm rambling, because as we record this, it is 5 hours and 40 minutes until puck drop for Game 7 of the Stanley Cup final. And I'm having a lot of feelings. If the Oilers win tonight, they will have told the most amazing the most perfect story of a hockey season that they could have possibly written. And I am a sucker for a good story. So I don't want to say anything and jinx anything, and I'm scared to, let's just say, let's go Oilers, and we'll leave it at that.
Skip sequence number 76. 76. So 76, this is 76, skip it.
Outside of editing anthologies, I just finished the sequel to my cozy urban fantasy novel. So it's not very horror-y, but I wrote a Norse mythology inspired cozy urban fantasy book called One in the Hand, which is about a woman whose grandmother who is in a long-term care facility, has a sword manifest in her room, and the main character has to figure out what the deal is with that, while at the same time also processing the fact that she appears to have sprouted wings. It's a whole thing. It's super fun. I wrote it in 2020, I think, when I just needed something kind of comforting to write. And I just finished the sequel to it, which I'm probably going to call With a Broken Wing, and sent it to my editor. So I'm hoping to have that out soon. And I'm also publishing an anthology of, well, it's not an anthology, it's a collection of it's called Prairie Spirits. And it's a bunch of it's not all ghosts, there's some demons and some other stuff in there, but it is poetry set in the prairies, sort of as I grew up in them, but reimagined, of course. I didn't actually have any demonic experiences when I was living in the prairies, but that is going to be out in October. But yeah, the best place to keep up with all of my stuff like that is definitely Patreon. But those are the top 3 things that are top of mind for me right now.
Testing. This is Karyn Raynor reading for Paquita.
So if there is an anthology theme, I'm looking around my office to try and pick something random. There's a picture of a coyote next to a picture of a statue here. So I'm going to say, if there is a themed anthology call... As for speculative fiction, I mean, yes, back when I started Niteblade in 2007, I think I had just started hearing the phrase speculative fiction, and I didn't fully understand what it was at the time. But now that I understand it, it's absolutely speculative fiction, right? Because speculative fiction is just sort of an umbrella that we can put fantasy, horror, dark fantasy, science fiction. We can put all of those genres underneath it. So, but I don't think I wouldn't, if I were rebranding Niteblade today in 2024, I wouldn't just call it speculative fiction, because I don't think that's quite specific enough. It's a little bit too broad. So I think that dark fantasy and horror is probably what I would have called it.
Curriculum vitae, with which I am familiar. A curriculum vitae, with which I am familiar.
And the other piece of advice I would give is that publishing is a small world. So try not to burn any bridges unintentionally. And I know that's super vague, but it kind of has to be because everybody's situation is different. But basically, just don't be a jerk. Because if you are a jerk, people are going to notice, and it is going to close doors before you even get a chance to open them. So definitely, if you cannot be a jerk, that will serve you well. And it'll also help with that first thing, right? If you're not a jerk, it'll be easier to find people, like-minded people who you want to spend time with and who want to spend time with you.
95. Alégrate, chiquilla. Pronto tú también serás una concubina de Gronk.
I also write a lot of poetry, and a not insignificant amount of that is quite dark. I usually have to put little warnings on it when I post it on my Patreon, which is actually what my primary focus is these days. I have a Patreon where I post at least one poem a month exclusively there, and one short story or poem exclusively there. So that's kind of where most of my writing focus is going, because if I'm producing a short story and a poem every single month, in addition to whatever editing or whatever I'm doing, that takes most of my creative energy. But I love it. I love having that place where I know people want to read the stuff that I'm writing, and I don't have to try and write to market or spend a lot of time submitting places, although I still do that now and then.
That was 60.
The hydra-slayer thing comes from the fact that I call my to-do list the Hydra, because every time I cut off one head, 2 more spring back out. So that's kind of why I'm a little bit rambly right now, because I do so many things that tie together, but not in a nice straight line. It's a lot of scribbles. And I don't want this to sound like a commercial for my Patreon, so this is the last thing I'll say about it. That is one other thing that it does fantastically for me, is that it gives me a place to put all of the things. So all of the squiggly lines can all connect in that one place. And I can write a book about bomber plane flying dogs in a post-climate catastrophe diesel punk-esque world. I can write a book about that. And I don't have to try and find a publisher for it, because I can put it on Patreon. And I did that. And I can write a collection of ghost poems, and I don't have to try and find a publisher for that. I can put it on Patreon. And so that's where my focus is, in order to try and tame the Hydra a little bit. In addition to that, we had kick-ass art by Marge Simon. Every story got illustrated in black and white, and we had the cover or the color illustrations. That alone kind of set us apart from most other smaller magazines. And the content, I think the kindness and the art and the community, it attracted stories and poems that were better than what we could possibly have expected for what we were paying, because those authors and poets were willing to take less money than they deserved because to be a part of that. And I know at least a couple of people told me that they submitted just on the chance that maybe they would get their story illustrated by Marge. So that cannot be understated.
70. Golf clap. 70. 70. 71. Bueno, doctor.
Have a great rest of your day.